Council for Medical Schemes has welcomed the agreement between the Competition Commission and Lancet and Empath Laboratories. This is to reduce the price of the COVID-19 PCR tests from 850 Rand to 500 Rand. Now, the complaint which was placed with the Commission back in October alleged that the price was unfairly inflated and in contravention of the Competition Act. Now, the Council's John Letsualo says this will encourage more people to test.
For us, look, we feel that takes the population to a lesser level in terms of affordability. So, Tembekile, I could say to you, look, we are quite happy as the Council for Medical Schemes for that reduction in terms of the pricing, because it's going to allow people to test more and, not to transmit the virus to other people. So we're quite delighted as the Council for Medical Schemes to say, look, people are going to go forward, going to test more, they're going to make sure that they get, the test and make sure that they know their status so that they not spread the virus.
Well, let's get some reaction on this particular story. We are joined now by the editor for the Financial Mail, Rob Rose. Rob, a very good morning to you, and thank you for your time. You penned a very strong piece around this particular matter, and I just want to go and characterize it the way that you have phrased it in your words, and you've called this an obvious racket. Why do you feel so strongly that this was, more than anything, a racket that has been embarked upon by these companies?
Morning. Well, essentially, these companies have been charging 850 Rand per test for months already, even though the prices of the raw materials had come down. Obviously, private companies are allowed to levy a price that they feel reflects the demand. But in this particular case, it did look to be unfairly benefiting from COVID, and from the pandemic, through something that people were taking in increasing amounts. The amount of tests that the private laboratories had performed over the last 18 months or so was about 10 million tests. And they would have made about, the private laboratories would have made revenues of, we estimated conservatively at about 8 billion Rand. Not all of that's profit, obviously, but there's a lot of money that's going to them, and the prices did seem to be extortionate given the costs that they had to pay.
Well, with such strong language and the use of a word such as extortion, that would mean then that there obviously has been unfairness here. Would there be an expectation that these companies be penalized? Is that what the Competition Commission should have done? And are there any indications that they are even going to go that route?
I don't think they're going to go that route. They're certainly not going to go that route with Lancet and Empath, two of the three laboratories that have reached this agreement. Basically, in exchange for them agreeing to drop their price to 500 Rand per test, the Competition Commission has now said they're going to stop the investigation. So there's not going to be any penalization of these companies. It has to be said that at one stage, perhaps the 850 Rand was a reasonable amount because importing tests from overseas was expensive. The thing is, though, that over the past couple of months, that dropped a lot. And with the economies of scale, given the fact that they had 10 million tests that they've done, they should have been able to drop the price. So perhaps it was reasonable at one stage to charge that, but it certainly wasn't recently. And for these companies to claim, that they couldn't afford to drop their prices, and 2 weeks ago, it was 850 Rand. This morning, you can get a PCR test for 500 Rand. That's a 41% difference, and that's a big amount to suddenly be able to drop your prices by.
Sure. The Council for Medical Schemes, one of the leaders there, John Letsualo, telling us this morning that actually there is still room for reduction or the lowering of this price from 500 Rand to even lower. Do you believe that indeed could be in the offing? And what needs to happen for these companies to actually drop it even further down? Because there is so much demand for these tests, Rob. And just to give you a simple example, if I test positive here at work, which I did, by the way, some 10 days ago, those people who would have been around me are suddenly forced to go and get a test at their own cost. That's a lot of money, and it tells you that we are going to be subjected to this for as long as COVID is with us.
It's a lot of money, exactly. It's difficult to say what is reasonable, obviously, because we don't have insight into their costs. These three laboratories gave their costs to the Competition Commission, who analyzed them and then said, actually, we think it's reasonable for you guys to charge 500 Rand. And this still allows you to get a profit margin on these tests. Now, what's interesting about the consent agreement that was signed with the Competition Tribunal is that these companies have agreed to keep the price at a maximum of 500 Rand. So they can drop the price lower if the various costs, the tests they import from overseas drop. They can drop their prices further. And they also have to report to the Competition Commission every 3 months and tell them what's happening with their costs. So there is scope to push the costs lower. It does depend on what happens to the price of the raw materials. And of course, the rand versus the dollar. I mean, if the rand spirals up, then obviously it's a lot more expensive to get these tests imported. But having said that, the Competition Commission did leave these companies with what they called a reasonable profit margin. So these guys aren't losing money on the tests, I wouldn't imagine. It's very difficult for us to say from the outside, are they still benefiting to an extent that they could reduce their prices, because we don't have insight into their financials.
Yeah.
But it would indicate, according to various people in the pathology industry and people who know the sector very well. I mean, I'm a journalist. I speak to these guys, but I'm not a pathologist myself.
Yeah.
They would say that there's still scope to drop it. But it's difficult for me on the outside to make that assessment until you've seen their financials.
Sure. Last question to you, Rob. And I guess it's around what the itemized pricing or itemized billing would include. Now, you've mentioned that they are going to be required to report to the Competition Commission in 3 months intervals or 3-month intervals. The question is, what should members of the public look out for so that if there is something that they are suspicious of, it is flagged? Because for these prices to be reduced to 500 Rand in the first place, it was as a result of complaints.
As a result of a complaint, and it was the Council for Medical Schemes, which keeps an eye on what the medical aids like Discovery and MedScheme and those guys are paying. And that's a very strong lobby. I mean, if you have a look at the power that Discovery has and the other medical aids, these guys are keeping a close eye on costs. They don't want to pay extra for tests. I mean, when you, as a private citizen, go and you've got medical aid, Discovery covers the cost of the test. So they don't want to pay more. So they will definitely keep an eye on it, and they will definitely complain to the council, who will then complain to the Competition Commission if there's a sign. But from the outside, what we can do, we see the price of the rand, for example, and we can see what the price of overseas testing kits, testing cartridges costs. And you've seen that come down quite a lot in the past year as they are more freely available across the world. So that's a way for the average person to keep an eye on what's going on. But you can also bet that Discovery won't want to pay a cent more than it has to. So it's going to try and keep the labs as honest as possible on that.
All right. Rob Rose, thank you very much for your insights there. He is the editor of the Financial Mail.